he stood up and made some very positive strides, but that was something that really relished home with me and other African Americans, that we did not get the chance to see Darren Williams go on to be our first African American Speaker of the House. So with that being in the worst of times, and last but not least, you know, some of the things about how we can become more recharged as a party, how we can recruit and not look down on those candidates, as Mr. Freeman said, that may work too hard, or other candidates that may not be working hard enough. How do we recruit, retain, and sustain viable, positive Democrats to move us forward in this new generation and time? You know, and as we look at the worst of times, some of the things that you guys may want to think about today, panelists, you know, for the first time, you know, our party leadership has changed for the first time in its history, both in the House and the Senate. That's something that's, you know, it's got a big stake in how we move the agenda of our state forward on a lot of issues, beginning with Medicaid. That will be a huge fight, Medicaid expansion, as we go into the legislative session. The loss, as I mentioned, of our Speaker designate, Derek Williams. Some of our local races, our mayoral race here in North Little Rock, some of our county races, really staged for some really interesting times for our party and our politics. And last but not least, when you think about Washington, D.C. panelists, we've got one standing lone Democrat left in our congressional delegation on the House and Senate side, and that's Mr. Pryor. And with that, you know, being the notion as we move forward, I think the question stands right. You know, from you all this afternoon, and we'll start with you, Representative Love, moving forward as a Democrat, a proud Democrat, your perspective, we're going to open with opening statements, and then we'll move right into questions. I'll be the timekeeper, so we ask that you keep your comments between a minute and a half, 2 minutes at most, and we'll try to move through this, and if there are questions of the audience afterwards, we'll try to allow a little time for that as well. So, Representative Love, will you please begin with opening statements?
Sure. Good afternoon. Or actually, yeah, good afternoon. I would like to start with this, and I'm gonna preface this as we're talking as a people, a group, a collective group that should focus on one agenda. And this is what I'm seeing right now. We need to have a spirit of volunteerism in the black community as far as working for our local candidates. We can I'm talking about from our city, JPs, to our state legislators. Now, it's not bad. I'm not saying that you shouldn't get paid from campaigns. But here's the thing is that, number one, African American candidates, they don't raise as much money as our counterparts. And so therefore, that's why I said we have to have a spirit of volunteerism. And I'll tell you why it's so important. Because sometimes we miss out on a few votes because we need an extra effort. And what that translates to at the state level is our power to move things, our leverage to bargain and see things happen. Now that we're moving into a session where the Democrats are not in power, that's more important than ever. And if we don't have the members there to leverage our power, it's an issue. It's an issue, and I'm not saying that our agenda is not heard. But it's a little better when you have more people to say, all right, I can vote this way for one thing, and you can, it's a game of give and take. And so I would say, number one, what we need to do is focus on a little more volunteering for our local and state legislative races so that we can see a more positive result. But number two, we have to learn how to raise some money in our community. It's no sense. We have a lot of money. We usually give to our gubernatorial races, but we don't focus that much on our races, the ones that, and I'm not saying the governor's race won't affect us, but our race is the one that really affects our communities. And I'm telling you, and I can't stress it enough, when you have 17, 18 members in the legislature trying to move your agenda, it's better than having 10. And we fight that battle all the time. And so I would say, starting off, Eddie's waving me out, but I would say starting off that, number one, we need to focus on a little more volunteering, but number two, the fundraising effort in our community needs to be stronger in order for us to move and make a larger impact on the agenda happening at the state level.
Thank you, Representative Love. And panelists, just to let you know, if you'll peek down here every now and again, I'm keeping time so that we can move through this process. I'll simply raise my hand. Ms. Abrams, and I failed to give this in my opening statements. After your opening statement, the question, and Representative Love, thank you, you did a great job of opening this conversation, but what has been the question that we're starting with here is, what has been the greatest impediment facing African American candidates seeking congressional and statewide offices here in Arkansas? Has it been race, money, lack of Democratic Party support, inability to craft universal messages, poor African American turnout and geography? Those in addition to an assortment of your own thoughts. Ms. Abrams, if you would, please give your opening statements and focus on that question.
Thank you. Those of you who know me, I am a history buff, and therefore I deal with history. When Barack chose for his theme forward, you can't go forward if you don't know where you have come from. And so that was the most important thing to me, is to help you to know from whence we have come. When you deal with a process, you have to know what are the basic ingredients that the process has. When we talk about the electoral process, we're talking about voters, those who are eligible to vote and those who are not, who may also be able to participate by volunteering. When we talk about the process, we're talking about candidates. We're talking about candidates who are recruited, candidates who volunteer to submit themselves. We're talking about lobbyists. We're talking about lobbyists who are paid, certified lobbyists. We're talking about lobbyists who come because of their issues. We have, the first thing that we deal with is legislators. And so the first thing I wanted to do was to tell you a little bit about the history. And it's from the lowest level of the process through the one that we've never had in this state. We've never had a congressman since the Emancipation Proclamation. We have not had anybody to be the head of the legislative process as relates to President Pro Tem or Speaker of the House. Back in 1997-98, we insisted, as before we had a structure, our infrastructure, and Sharon Priest was the one who agreed that we needed to have a paper trail of how much participatory democracy we had at the electoral process. And in this is everybody, because that's a place where you could know that the records were there. I went back to look and see who had been elected from the lowest level to the highest level. And I've kept those ever since, even though that we had the state office, the Secretary of State's office, has not bought into that need for an audit history that we can follow. It's amazing when you go back and look here and see that there were more people back in 1997-98 than we have now. And it was because we had more people at the grassroots level, which is that we started with the JP, which is the most important level for learning how to participate, learning how government runs, and the fiscalness of that. That's the place where you learn about ethics. That's how you learn whether you'll go to jail or won't go to jail, because you don't understand. The other thing is that it's about what is the history. And so I went back to look and see what was the legislative history that those people that are in this book made for us. What laws did they get introduced? What laws did they get passed that are now still on the books, or which have been tried to repeal them? The other thing is that once we got beyond just needing to know basic information, we went to, let's start keeping some of our own records. But we couldn't quite get it to that point, but we still had a Secretary of State that says, I recognize if I continue this, I will help myself. And so Bill McEwen, who was one of our historic names that we became very close to, and that's when we first got into, after the Emancipation Proclamation, and start having people. And so we know that there are three. I'm an educator too. People see, hear, and they experience. So you heard what I said, and now I want you to see what I'm talking about. This was what we had where have we gone from there to now? This represents those from the JP level all the way up. It represents those that we had at the school board level. That represents, what do you tell me, baby? Oh, you told me a time.
You're fine. You can wrap up. You're
Oh,
fine.
I can wrap up.
It's
Okay.
tough to
I
raise
know.
the time clock on.
I just want you to know they changed the time. They told me that we have opening statements of 10 minutes each, and then we would have the
Yes.
Q&A. So I'm not that, ignoring you. Then the other one is, I went back to the level where that we have the record of where we were when we started, and we start really making progress, and where we are now when we are retrogressing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Next up, Gary, if you would open with your opening statement. And again, the question, what has been the greatest impediment facing African-American candidates seeking congressional and statewide offices in Arkansas?
I speak to my experience working with the president's campaign to that. But Representative Armstrong threw out a few things earlier. Is it race? Is it money? Is it geography? Is it a knowledge-based issues, cohesiveness? And the answer is yes. It's all of that. It is all of that. And I think to some degree you have to address all of those things. On the first, I think it would be foolish to try to ignore that. Definitely here in the South, in Arkansas in particular, I can speak firsthand, race still plays a role. Absolutely. And to ignore it almost does more harm than good. And by almost, I mean it does. So let's be clear on that. But it was also a great opportunity working with the president's campaign and stepping back from Arkansas and looking at the national level. What the president showed us is that coalition building and unity and diversity in a campaign is very powerful. It works. And we can't do it by ourselves. The difference in a lot of the states between the president winning and losing was the minority vote. If you look at Ohio, John Kerry lost. He got 81% of the African American vote. Barack Obama won with roughly the same percentage of the white vote, but he got 95% of the African American vote. That's why he won Ohio. Those things matter. And more the Republican Party is isolating itself, creating a vacuum where it's all folks that look like me. And unfortunately, they don't think like I do. They don't realize the need for diversity. Just this morning in the 2nd Congressional Caucus, we were electing our representatives to the executive committee, and I was one of the candidates in that. After we'd elected 3 white males, I removed myself from consideration because I recognize we need diversity from the very small all the way to the top. You can't start seeking diversity at the highest levels of office. You have to seek them at the lowest levels. And sometimes you have to educate folks like me to know when there's things that are bigger than you. And when you need to put, sure, I would have liked to have had that honor, but there are things that are bigger than me. And that's come because, folks like Ms. Abrams have spent a lot of time educating me to be aware of those needs. But I think the one thing you can take away from the president's campaign, the motto, respect, empower, include, it's a thing that they drove into all of us from the top to the bottom from day one as not just words on a PowerPoint or something we say, but how we ran our campaign. If you wanted to be involved, you were involved. If you wanted to lead, you could lead. And we always treated our folks with respect. So taking those, implementing the neighborhood team model like we did all across the country, I think can be done in the state level much, much better, and it does work. I see Eddie's raising his hand, and I don't have the clout that Ms. Abrams does, so I'm going to hush and let it go on to the next one.
We all recognize that, Gary. You're good. Next up, we have